Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 444 for the 18th of Shevat in a regular year. Procrastination. We've all been guilty of it at some point or another, haven't we? I mean, I remember back in the day when I was a student in college, pulling all-nighters pretty frequently, to write papers that I didn't start until that night, which is silly because, if I would have just taken the time to begin the paper at the time that it was assigned instead of waiting to the last minute, then I wouldn't have had to pull these crazy all-nighters that were really uncomfortable, really detrimental to my health. And while, the result was usually pretty good, I remember, it felt like getting by at the skin of my teeth a lot of times. Like I remember literally running to school, like after finishing a paper, after writing the last sentence of the paper, and then like rushing to turn it in literally like after, shutting the computer because it was due like in the next hour or so. And the whole time just regretting it and saying, next time I'm going to start the papers on time. I'm not going to wait till the last minute. And lo and behold, I did it again. So this is, we do this to ourselves. And, while we're very conscious of it when we kind of like step back, when we kind of zoom out of the scene, we can see that procrastination is not really the right way to go about things. Nevertheless, we do it. We do it all the time. So why? Why do we procrastinate in such a manner? So it's really weird. It's like our brain kind of plays this funny trick on us. It's the whole idea of like the instant gratification kind of thing that we kind of tend to get lost in the moment. And it's hard for us sometimes without foresight, without meditation, to think ahead. So what we're concerned about really is like our immediate pleasure, our immediate sensations. And sometimes this is going to be at the expense of the later of the consequences of what's going to happen in the future. So, let's say, I got assigned a paper that was due in 2 weeks. So day one, I would say to myself, do I really feel like working on this paper? No, I don't. I'd rather read a book. I'd rather talk to my friends. I'd rather do a whole bunch of other things. So the pleasure of doing all those other activities outweighed the relatively minor amount of pain that I would have entailed through beginning writing the paper, doing the research for the paper. Same thing on day 2, day 3, same thing. So it's like there's sort of like this constant calculation that we do inside of ourselves. Pain, pleasure, and we always veer towards the pleasure. The problem with this is that, as we see in the case of procrastination, that if we constantly just think about immediate pleasure versus immediate pain, this can get us into a lot of trouble because in terms of the bigger picture, this is constantly seeking immediate pleasure can actually end up leading to a much greater amount of pain than if we would have just dealt with that pain in the beginning, the small amount of pain in the beginning, So the famous philosopher Aristotle actually kind of had a sense of this, where he discussed this concept. I don't know if he came up with this term or just, discussed it, called eudaimonia. What is eudaimonia? So eudaimonia can be contrasted with happiness. Happiness, as described by Aristotle, was, just a simple pleasure seeking, feeling good, doing different activities that make you feel good. But again, like we mentioned, these feel good behaviors might feel good in the moment, but they don't necessarily have the best consequences later on. Versus eudaimonia is a Greek word that kind of implies this state of happiness, but it's in a much more meaningful way. It's in a way that kind of like crosses across lifetime, that has implications for one's entire life. It's sort of like, it's not only just a sense of pleasure that a person's having, but there's a sense of meaning to what they're doing. There's a sense of, good consequence to the actions that a person's engaged with. And now Aristotle's recommendation with all of this is that, that our goal in life is not to seek happiness so much as to seek eudaimonia, and that this is like the ultimate state that a person wants to achieve. And, whether we use the term eudaimonia or another term or whatever, we kind of all have this sense that truly, if we take a step backwards, it's like, were those small moments of pleasure worth it in the long run if they're ultimately going to lead to a greater pain? No, right? So how do we break out of this vicious cycle? And what does this have to do with the Tanya, you may be asking, right? So we know that the Tanya, if you've been following along and listening to this podcast for a while, you know that a lot of the Tanya is really based around living a more conscious life, not just being slaves to our animal instincts, being slaves to our impulses, but actually living in a way that is what is a Beinoni? This book is called the Sefer Shel Beinonim. A Beinoni is sort of like the epitome of what a human being is capable of. Somebody who has agency, who recognizes their agency, lives in a conscious way, with forethought, doesn't just, kind of just do the next thing that feels good to them, but they kind of live a more proactive lifestyle. And this is really, if you think about it, the solution to this procrastination, the solution to reaching a state of living in a way of a more eudaimonic type of lifestyle, as opposed to a happiness, pleasure-based lifestyle, is really taking the time to meditate and to contemplate and to be aware, to be conscious of your actions, to be conscious of your life. Now, the Tanya is going to take this a lot deeper, because we're going to bring in God into the picture. And we actually started talking about this yesterday. So we began this discussion yesterday. We began a new chapter 25 of Likkutei Amarim, where we started talking about this in terms of transgressions, in terms of how to kind of use our minds and our meditation to help us not transgress anything in the Torah, not do anything against the will of God. And we did this by really following a logical progression, whereby we came to understand that if a person does anything that's against the will of God, this actually is insane. It's actually not logical that anybody would want to go against the will of God. Because even though, yes, sometimes transgressions can have a certain pleasure aspect to them, like non-kosher food. I'm sure it tastes very good, illicit sexual activity, very pleasurable in the moment and all of that. But at the same time, anything that's a transgression, anything that we do that's against the will of God, entails us being separate from Him, separate from our source, which actually is the most painful thing for our souls. And it's so painful, in fact, that we actually recognize this on a conscious level when we're faced with like a life and death kind of situation, where we're faced to contend with this, where we're faced to like realize, is it God or the world? Which one do you want? Where it's made explicit to us, like bow down to an idol or die. And renounce your Judaism or die. And we see time and time again throughout history that Jews of all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of levels, all kinds of observance, were willing to give up their lives rather than to renounce their Judaism, to renounce their God. So this is because really deep down, when push comes to shove, we have this sane part of ourselves that realizes that we don't want to be separate from God. And what we need to do, this is all, again, yesterday's episode, is in order to prevent ourselves from transgressing any of God's laws, is by really tapping into this on a daily basis, and not just be aware of it just in a life and death situation, but to try to really get in tune with this part of ourselves that doesn't want to be separate from God, and that recognizes that any transgression, as small as the transgression might be, is separating us from God, just like idolatry does. So now today, we're going to take this same mentality, the same way of thinking, but we're going to apply it to the proactive mitzvahs, the mitzvahs aseh, the positive commandments. So, there's two aspects of serving God in Judaism. There's the aspect of refraining from doing negative behaviors, refraining from doing things that God doesn't want us to do. And then there's the positive aspect, that there's many things that God wants us to do, like lighting candles on Friday night, putting on tefillin if you're a man, eating kosher, actively eating kosher. There's so many different mitzvahs that we have. Giving charity is an active mitzvah. Learning Torah, prayer, these are active mitzvahs. These are proactive mitzvahs, positive commandments. So this is the topic of today's Tanya, how is it that we can use the same meditation, the same idea of really thinking about the big picture, really thinking about our deepest sane self inside, to use this to help us really be motivated to be more proactive in our keeping of the positive commandments, to be more enthusiastic, and to do these positive commandments with more alacrity when sometimes we're feeling lethargic, when our impulses bring us down, when we have this urge to procrastinate when it comes to serving God. So as we'll see, it's the same thing. It's really about just thinking about the big picture. It's thinking about, even though maybe in the moment it might feel good to be lazy, to kind of relax instead of learn Torah, instead of give that money to tzedakah, instead of, putting our full self into prayer. At the end of the day, the pleasure that we get from relaxing in those moments, which is, ultimately taking us away from that, perceived pain that we would have to take ourselves out of that laziness. It's like, is that comparable at all to the pain of death? Right? Like, it's like, we all know the image of like, if somebody had a gun to your head, would you do whatever, like, God forbid, we should never have that trial. But we all know when somebody has a gun to their head, they move a lot faster. They do a lot more things, because the pain of death is a lot more painful. It's more painful than pretty much anything else, right? Like, a person would be willing to, do a million push-ups if they had to eat really disgusting food. Like, they do all kinds of things that they would never do in their regular life if a gun were put to their head, because at the end of the day, any choice that you're making between pain or pleasure, when it comes to death is the ultimate pain that we want to avoid. So since this is the case, and when we can become aware of this, when we can become really conscious of the fact that as much as we don't like the feeling of death, we want to avoid death at all costs. At the same time, we know that as a Jew, the strength of our Jewish soul is so strong that we'd actually even be willing to withstand the pain of death rather than go against God, rather than be separate from God. This should motivate us. This should make us realize that how precious the mitzvahs that we have are, and really prevent us from being lazy, really prevent us from procrastinating, so to speak, on any of the mitzvahs, and motivate us to want to do things in a good way, want to proactively keep the commandments. Because again, when we weigh it out, it's like the little bit of pain that we're avoiding through procrastination, through avoiding putting our full self into that mitzvah, is that at all comparable in any way, shape, or form to the pain of death that we'd be willing to withstand rather than bow down to an idol? So it's like, once we recognize this about ourselves, once we recognize our power, that we have within ourselves the power to withstand the pain of death and to serve God so strongly, even when faced with this pain of death, then it would be easy. It would be like so simple to then say, like, it's nothing to, like, I wake up early in the morning and spend that extra time, in prayer like that. Yeah, it's a little painful, but like, really, like, is it like, I can do anything. I can, I'd be willing to withstand the pain of death to worship God. So I can't wake up a little bit earlier to pray properly to God. So yeah, so that's the basic idea of what we're going to be focusing on today. So enough with my introduction. Now let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. And as mentioned, we are still in the middle of chapter 25 of Likkutei Amarim. So the Alter Rebbe begins today saying that everything that we learned thus far in yesterday's section about the idea of how to prevent the meditation a person can think about to prevent them from doing a transgression, a prohibition, all of this could apply to the precept of doing good, of ve'aseh tov, and you should do good, meaning to do the positive commandments, and what this really means is to overcome, like a lion, with and strengthen themselves with the determination of their heart against our Yetzer Hara, against our evil inclination that makes our body heavy and that brings us into a state of laziness. Where does this come from? This comes from the element of earth that comes from the animal soul. So if you remember, we spoke about this in the very beginning of the Tanya about how there are different elements. There are 4 basic elements that the nature of the animal soul comes from, and which are where these different negative traits come from. So the trait of laziness comes from the element of earth within the animal soul. And this element of earth, which manifests as a state of laziness, how does this manifest? This manifests as making a person lazy from doing any kind of service of God that's going to entail any kind of effort and toil. For example, what's an example of this? To be involved in labor of Torah with concentration and with their mouth, so that they'll never stop speaking words of Torah. So if you've been following along this podcast together with me, you know that Torah is not always easy. A lot of times when I'm preparing for these podcast episodes, it takes a lot of work. It really does. Some are more difficult than others. Even the ones that are not that difficult, it requires a certain amount of concentration and mental toil to do so. And this is really what God wanted. So the Alter Rebbe brings a teaching from the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, page 5b, where it says that every person should subjugate themselves to the words of Torah, like an ox to the yoke and the donkey to the load. So we're actually supposed to be working in Torah. We're not supposed to it's not supposed to be easy for us. God purposefully made Torah in such a way that we are supposed to work at it. And not only in terms of learning Torah, but this is true also in terms of tefillah, in terms of davening, that when we pray, we're supposed to be praying with our entire being, with all of our energy. So the Alter Rebbe doesn't say this right here, but in fact, we know from other places that tefillah, prayer, is actually called avoda. It's called work. So it's really supposed to be and meant to be work. And so too, when it comes to our money, and when it comes to the service of God that involves our money, for example, giving tzedakah. So that also, it's not always easy to give tzedakah, and we're supposed to really give tzedakah beyond what's comfortable for us. So basically, God wants us to do things that are beyond our comfort zone. And there's so many different other examples of this that have to do with struggling with our evil inclination, because our evil inclination is going to come up with all kinds of different reasons why a person really needs to hold on to their money and not give so much to tzedakah. They have to preserve their health, and things like that. And in fact, we need to work against this. So now the Alter Rebbe goes on to say that to conquer these impulses, to conquer these evil impulses, is actually something that's very, very accessible to every person when the person really determines in their heart that this is what they want to do. And actually will come to realize that straining themselves in this way, to really toil in Torah study and prayer and giving tzedakah, whatever it is, like to the fight against the Yetzer Hara is actually a much lighter fight than the fight against, and the suffering involved in this fight is much less than the suffering of death, God forbid, as we said in the introduction, right? But yet we see that they would be willing to give up their lives, in order not to be separate from God in a true way, in order to bow down to idols, God forbid. So, right. So again, to explain this, does it take work to learn Torah? Does it take work to daven with our full heart? Does it take work to give away some of our money to tzedakah, even if we don't want to? Yes. Is it painful? Is it, does it involve some suffering? Maybe, it's like it's toil. It's hard work. But when you think about it, it's like, that hard work, that toil, that suffering that we will need to endure in order to do these things, it's so minute if you compare it to the suffering of death. But yet we would be willing, every single Jew would be willing to give up their lives rather than to truly be separate from God in terms of idolatry. So when we realize this, then we realize that, the suffering that I need to endure in order to just put my little extra effort into serving God, that's nothing. That is absolutely nothing. And I'm totally capable of this. And not only am I capable of this, a person will come to accept this suffering, quote unquote, accept this toil with love and willingly in order to cleave to God eternally, because ultimately it's like we're coming to realize our true will, our true desire, which is to cleave to God and to be one with God. And then it's like, once we realize how much we'd be willing to give up, that we'd be willing to give up our lives rather than sacrifice this oneness with God, here we have the opportunity to connect with God in our lifetime, and it doesn't even require that much work. So of course we're going to want to do it, and we're going to want to do it willingly and with great love, because we recognize the fact that through doing this, through arousing our love and our will to do God's will, this is going to arouse God's supernal love, and God's supernal love will become revealed in an unobscured and inner kind of way. And when God's will is revealed in such a way that is without any obscurity, without being hidden at all, then what gets revealed is the unified nature of this God, and the unified nature and the realization, the recognition that nothing has an independent existence of its own. So thus, then our soul, then the person's godly soul who's engaged in this meditation and in this behavior, recognizes that it becomes totally unified with God. Not only his godly soul, but actually his animal soul as well, and all of their garments become united with the supreme will, which ultimately means with God himself, because God and his will are one and the same. And then in conclusion, the thing to recognize and realize about this unification that happens, this union, is that this union above is eternal, because God is above time, right? And so thus, because God is above time, and because this supernal will is above time and is eternal, so too when we reveal this will and in our speech, which is Torah, because because what is Torah? Torah is God's wisdom. And as we spoke about before, when we speak words of Torah, when we learn Torah, we're connecting to God's will and wisdom in this way. We're connecting in an eternal way. So we're connecting in a way that is above time. As it says in Yeshayahu, in chapter 40, verse 8, that the word of God shall stand forever. And similarly, we say in our prayers, we say that his words live and endure eternally. And then another place in prayers that we say, this is from the Yigdal prayer, he will never alter or exchange his law, etc. So basically, this is to make us recognize that, just as God is eternal and God is above time and not bound to time. So when we do God's will and we tap into God's Torah, this gives us the ability to really tap into this eternality, this transcendent nature of life and of reality. So that's the end of the section for today. And so just, in conclusion, really bringing it all together is, again, this recognition of when we live a more mindful life, when we really recognize who we are in our essence, then what can feel painful at first glance, what can feel like too much suffering, or what can feel like, oh, it's too difficult, I'm not in the mood today to pray with my full effort, to learn properly, or, the person's asking for tzedakah, I don't know, I don't really feel like giving them tzedakah. Like that little feeling of that sigh, that's difficult for us. It's like when we compare that to the pain of death, it becomes so silly in comparison to that. And when we recognize that our nature and the fact that we have this ability to overcome death even in order to serve God, then it will become like nothing, like laughable to be able to overcome other impulses that we have to not put our fullness into our service of God in our everyday life. So that's the end of the section for today, and we'll continue along these lines tomorrow. So stay tuned for that, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow. And until then, have a great day.